I mean, India has announced the 2070 net zero target. So first of all, we need a roadmap on how we are going to get there and what sectors are we going to work on first. And I think we don't have really the luxury of sequencing. Hello, I'm Minal Pathak. I'm a senior scientist with the Working Group 3 Technical Support Unit of the UN IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I'm also the Associate Professor at Ahmedabad University. And you're listening to Understanding the Future podcast.
Hello everyone, I'm Punit Gandhi, Senior Associate with the Climate Center for Cities at the National Institute of Urban Affairs, and welcome to the Season 3 of Understanding the Future podcast. I have been working and studying in the field of sustainability and climate change for more than 8 years, and I have realized that I have a lot of questions on how we can build cities in India that are more climate focused. With Understanding the Future podcast, I interact with experts, entrepreneurs, and government officials to understand what it takes to bring all the different solutions to the ground, as well as how can systemic changes be developed on ground. We will further anchor all the topics being discussed with different skill sets required. This will help us understand the future of cities and future of work in Indian context. If you are tuning in for the first time, do check out our previous episodes. Also, don't forget to check out the Climate Practitioners India Network, a members-led solutions-oriented platform for climate practitioners across India. And join it through the show note. Hope you enjoy the podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Season 3 of Understanding the Future. I'm your host Punit Gandhi, Senior Associate with the Climate Center for Cities, and today we have with us Dr. Minal Pathak. She is a Senior Scientist of Working Group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, popularly known as IPCC, and she is also an Associate Professor at the Ahmedabad University. Today, she will help us understand how can we achieve science-based targets. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Puneet, for inviting me.
So I think we'll start off with one of the most basic questions that we can come up with. That how does an IPCC report help us understand climate change? What are we actually looking at it from that report that helps us understand this is climate change and what are we trying to do with it?
So before I answer your question directly, I wanted to just let you know what the IPCC is. And so the IPCC, as most of you know, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a UN body. It was established by the World Meteorological Organization and United Nations Environment Program about 30 years ago. And this is an organization of governments that are members. So currently the IPCC has 195 member governments, and thousands of people globally contribute to the work of the IPCC. So there's a whole group of authors from around the world who write these assessment reports. They volunteer their time as authors. And an IPCC assessment report is typically a report that assesses thousands of scientific papers published each year within that cycle, which is typically about 5 years. So every 6 to 7 years, there is an IPCC assessment report that is written by scientists, but the summary is approved by governments line by line. And these reports undergo a thorough peer review process where governments and experts comment throughout the cycle on the report. So it's an open and transparent review process, and this cycle is the 6th cycle. So we recently published the 6th assessment report of the IPCC.
Thank you so much. I think that's a good baseline to start off with.
And maybe part of your question was, what does the report say?
Yeah.
Right. So the IPCC actually has 3 working groups. Working Group 1, which is the physical science basis. Working Group 2, which deals with the adaptation, so impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation. And Working Group 3, which is about mitigation, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So I work with the mitigation working group, and so I will discuss the findings from the Working Group 3 report that was released in April. So I guess it's been widely covered in media. So you would have heard. We are at a unique point in history. Did you want to say something for me?
No. Go ahead.
Okay. So, yeah, well, I mean, global greenhouse gas emissions have continued to rise. And if we were to achieve the global mitigation emission to reduce catastrophic climate change, then we need to have peaked before 2025, peaked our emissions before 2025. And that sets out a really steep target globally. And to achieve these targets, we'll need rapid and unprecedented action across all sectors. So energy, transport, industry, land use, agriculture, and forestry. So, I mean, it is a steep target. I wouldn't say that there is no progress. There is some good news, right? Some countries have managed to decouple emissions. There's been rapid growth in renewable energy. In fact, the report says that about 85% costs have come down of solar energy. There's been a wide-scale reduction in cost of EV batteries. Policies have worked in many countries, but where we are at this stage, the gap between what is achieved and what needs to be achieved is huge. And therefore, the report spells out action across sectors for reducing emissions. So the report has chapters on buildings, transport, industry, and discusses these various options to achieve these targets, including, of course, governance, finance, and policy that enable these transitions. We also have a chapter on cities, so human settlements and what actions can be taken in cities to reduce emissions.
That sounds very interesting and exciting, as well as a bit scary as well. I will put it that way. There are a lot of things that yes, we have achieved considerable amount of growth. We are trying to move towards action as well, and a lot of governments have taken up policy-based rules as well to make sure that there is enough things possible to be done. But as you pointed out, we should peak by 2025. It's 3 years down the line, which makes it a bit more challenging in terms of what can be done by each government, especially. I'll come to the Indian context later because I think that again has its own wide range of issues. But globally, then, if you have to consider what are some of the things that developed countries trying to make sure that, okay, this is how we will reduces based on these kind of gaps that you just pointed out, that the gaps can be in any of the field, any of the intersectional area. What are certain things that globally countries are trying to do on those lines?
I think the first and foremost is, of course, decarbonizing energy supply. So basically, clean energy. So all electricity must be low carbon by 2050, and this must allow for the electrification of end uses like transport, industry, etc. And therefore, we need large scale. We need the systems and infrastructure in place to enable this electricity transition. And I think countries are investing in this, including of course CCS, that will be the carbon capture and storage that will be necessary to allow to offset some of the emissions from fossil fuel use, but other forms of clean power, of course renewable energy being priority, but also investments in hydrogen. And the good news is that the unit costs of these low carbon technologies have fallen, but their adoption really needs to be scaled up. So that's one. The second one is decarbonizing industry, which means not only the traditional solutions of improving energy efficiency, but the new age solutions, or the new jargon that we say, circular economy solutions, deploying carbon capture and storage, because some industry sectors are not easy to decarbonize, like cement, for example, right? Yeah. So those industries will need to capture some of the carbon dioxide that will be emitted. And then I mentioned cities, and the report calls out for these strategies for different types of cities. So, I mean, you said Indian cities. I know the developing country cities are at a special stage, and therefore the report for the first time calls out strategies for the more established cities, the growing cities, and then still smaller cities, and how these different types of cities can adopt different types of solutions. Like the established cities might need retrofits, versus the rapidly growing cities could now invest in low carbon infrastructure. And finally, the point I want to highlight is the focus on behavior.
Yeah.
because for the first time in the IPCC report, we have a whole chapter called Demand, Services and Social Aspects of Mitigation, and where we call out to behavior change. And I think developed countries need to consider this very important dimension of mitigation, that it's not only about technology, but we'll need large scale change in consumption patterns and behavior if we were to meet our mitigation targets.
Yeah, absolutely. I think behavior is surely one of the most challenging, I would say, but one of the most interesting fields to also study about and make sure that if we can actually transition towards a better services and solutions, I think it can be a game changer for sure. But let's backtrack a bit and try to understand that, yes, so now there are three different work groups and we are working on the mitigation part. So from science perspective, if we have to look at it, what are some of the major challenges that we have to first identify? Let's first consider global level, and then for the Indian context we can also do the national level.
I think, working group one, which is just from the climate science perspective, given that we have all these, as we speak, Ahmedabad had a massive spell of rainfall yesterday, and, homes and streets and shops and buildings were flooded. And just a month ago, we were reeling under extreme heat. And from the science perspective, I think we need to understand these events. We need to have better data on the past climate at the local levels. We need more granular place-based data to be able to inform the future solutions. You can plan a city, but you need to know where it is at right now. And from the climate science perspective, the science of attribution, which of these events are linked to climate change? What happens in the future under different warming scenarios? So you have scenarios that predict that warming might range between, let's say, 2 degrees to 3.5, 3.7 degrees. So what is it that we are going to see if the temperature increases by 2 degrees? What does it mean for different regions? What does it mean for different cities? So from a science perspective, I think we need to understand this and then to be able to communicate this to the relevant stakeholders. And businesses, cities, all those stakeholders who are involved in, let's say, deciding, for want of a better word, the future of people and businesses and establishments and the economy. That includes agriculture and so many other sectors that will be affected by the changing climate.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and I think these scenarios are absolutely important to also just monitor how have we progressed. I think going forward with it, unless and until we are able to do that, we might not have comparative data to figure out, okay, where are we now, and where are we trying to go. But I don't know. I think this can taken later, or we can also. I would just like to explore on the lines of. I do understand data is one of the most important aspects to even start considering how things are moving forward. But data validation, I think, is also a pretty challenging task, and especially when in today's day and age, when we are talking about a lot of IoT systems coming into the picture, at least I know from the point of view that government is trying to work out with that as well, that there can be some systems in which IoT systems can also be benchmarked, but can that data be used easily? Because I think even if you're talking about weather monitoring stations, let's just keep that as a simple example. We have 1, 2, or maybe 5 weather monitoring stations in a city at max. If we want to go on a large scale from place to place, even in a city, we might need an IoT-based system because then it's easier to capture the data, and you might not have to invest so much into an actual automatic weather station. So will that kind of data might also work, or how will that function? Because I think there is a gap over there as well from this.
Right. So there are two issues here. One is that the data that we have, whether that's credible, that's available, and by available I mean available in the public domain, and that's understandable. Like these data centers can download a huge amount of Excel sheets. How does, for example, a city a government use that data or access that data? So that's one issue. So even if there are 5 monitoring stations, are you as a citizen of your city able to access or to be able to understand that data. So that's one aspect of it. The second is to build the data, to enhance the quality of the data that's credible. So therefore, I think, of course, the IoT will be useful, and it's inevitable that it will happen, and it will happen faster than we think it will happen. But I wonder that for given the climate challenge, whether it will be fast enough or not, because I think we are just running against time. We are really behind on where we need to be, and therefore anything that happens after 15 years is just way too late. I think in the mitigation landscape.
I do think so as well, because I think while we have improved drastically on technology part, I would say it's not that we have not improved upon it, and especially in India as well with the kind of digital systems. Things are progressing ahead, and I am hopeful as well that hopefully we will be able to see that change in digital systems as well, that we have better enhanced data, because somewhere we also collect data from cities on different climate aspects, much more on the municipal level of what all things are there in the city or not. But I think from a broader perspective of how things are changing, this might be a very important part of it. So what are some other major challenges that India has, if you have to take it from this perspective? So I think one is the adaptation point of view, that as you mentioned, that as Ahmedabad faces, or most of the other cities also faces, for severe heat waves and then rainfall. What are the other things from mitigation perspective, if you have to look at, India needs to focus on?
Well, India needs to focus on everything. That's a short answer to your question, but it's a simplified answer. I think we will have to work towards. I mean, India has announced a 2070 net zero target. So first of all, we need a roadmap on how we are going to get there, and what sectors are we going to work on first. And I think we don't have really the luxury of sequencing. So if we were having this conversation, say 25 years ago, then I'd say, let's take energy first, and then we'll take transport, and then we'll take industry. But now we are at a stage where we have to look at all the sectors. And therefore, I think the data part I come back to again, that we need to assess the baseline situation of where we are. India, I think, needs to ramp up really clean energy. And there are low-hanging fruits, right? Let's talk about, like, for example, transport. And some of the solutions for mitigation are not new. For example, the investment in public transport, or just setting up infrastructure for transport. That's not new. What is new is now setting up infrastructure. So there are solutions that already existed, like urban planning and development solutions. There are new solutions, like the infrastructure for electric vehicles. And there are still further technology solutions, like maybe hydrogen for freight, which is still at a very nascent stage. So India really needs to work on these three areas. One is policy and regulation. The second one is investment in these technologies so that they can be upscaled. And the third is facilitating or regulating consumption for some sections of the society. Because we are in a unique position, right? We have a large section of the population which hardly consumes, but a small section which is really growing. And if you looked at yesterday's UN report that came out, then we are going to be the largest most populated country globally. We will overtake China, and our growth still continues. So well, it's an opportunity, but from the climate change perspective, it's a very big challenge, especially for mitigation, because just to meet the growing demands for infrastructure and services for this large population is really going to be a challenge. And I think India really needs to work on how we could at least add the new infrastructure, which is climate proof and low carbon, and then we look at solutions such as alternate materials. Maybe design our buildings differently. I'll just give you one example, like, building codes. Now you have these building and development control regulations for states. Okay, if you look at these regulations, they sometimes point to the national building. What is it called? Energy
National
efficiency
building
code.
ECBC.
Yeah.
Yeah.
ECBC, right? Like, I think these codes really need to be updated at the national level, and to ensure that the states look at it. Like, you will just find scattered references to climate change. We are not at a stage where we can afford to have these very lenient development standards. So I would say, I mean, there are these low-hanging fruits which really do not cost much, right? But so we have to start thinking about some of these solutions really now.
I do agree. I think I'm on the same lines, and I would also like to see things progress as fast as possible. And but I'm also not sure how to make it progress as fast as possible. I think that is one of the reasons that we are talking to so many people to understand what are the different systems in place for all different languages, so that it's easier to progress ahead. And coming to something like net zero is not an easy concept for people to understand, because people still get confused about, are we just talking about electricity going to renewable, or are we talking about how are we going to make sure that there is no carbon emissions? But I think it is not that. So if you can just highlight what are we looking at it from net zero as well, or a country like India or any other country can try to focus on it for what are the things that it can look towards when it is trying to look at net zero?
Right. So basically, in very simple words, net zero means cutting emissions to as close to zero as possible without any without any remaining emissions reabsorbed from the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I repeat that
Yes,
answer?
yes, yes.
Sorry. Net zero, yeah, yeah. Net zero means reducing greenhouse gas emissions to as close to zero or zero, with the remaining emissions being reabsorbed either by the atmosphere, by the oceans, or by the forests. Which means that if I'm emitting, say, X units of greenhouse gas emissions, then somehow I need to remove X units. So either I reduce X to a fraction of X, and then whatever fraction that remains, I try to offset that. Okay, so first of all is the challenge of really steeply reducing the emission, and then there are these, like I mentioned earlier on this podcast, that there's a small fraction of the emissions that would still remain, right? Maybe through the use of natural gas somewhere or in industry, and that's the amount that you have to offset either by growing trees or by using technologies like um, or you could, for example, use carbon capture and storage, yeah, or even more advanced technologies. But I really don't want to go into that technology space right now. And the reason, of course, as you might know, but for the listeners, is that these technologies are not proven to scale. They are still not very well understood, especially their risks, their costs, and their large scale implications for the planet. So there are technologies that are being discussed, but we really don't know if we can depend on those technologies for solving the climate problem.
Yeah, no,
So our
absolutely.
best option, yeah, sorry.
Go ahead,
Go on.
sorry. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I wanted to say that our best option and really the only option is to look at sectoral solutions, to look at integrated solutions that we already know and find ways to implement these.
Yeah. No, I do agree. And I think one of the, like, I was going to come to the next question and you have partially answered it already. But how much can we really offset? Because even if we grow so much of forest, that is one part I think which is easiest, but it takes time. Your trees are not going to grow overnight. It will take its own course of time to even start absorbing that much amount of carbon. And then, while it is very important to make sure something like urban heat island is reduced with that, and for that we need to make sure that we are doing more trees. That will eventually lead to lower energy consumption. But at the same time, something like carbon capture and storage, I do agree that it's currently very expensive in terms of Indian context as well. Might be some of the Western world might be able to use it, but for India or global South per se, I don't. Are these technology even viable to any extent?
They are viable. They are viable.
Financially.
I mean, because yeah, they are viable. I mean, see, the question is, what is the cost of climate change versus the cost of technology, right?
Yeah.
So viability is to be discussed in what is the future that you want, and are you willing to look at to pay a little more to avoid that future that you don't want, right?
Yeah.
And there are countries who have the means to be able to finance these technologies, and some pilot scale work is going on CCS. the problem is that the scale that we need is really going to be challenging to achieve, and but I don't see a way around it, because if you want to continue using fossil fuels, then you have to find a way to put those emissions somewhere, and therefore CCS seems to be the only well, viable, not maybe cost wise, but only viable solution, because like you said, planting large scale trees requires land, and where is the land? And it's like, who's going to do it? So 10 years ago, we were discussing about the budget, and we were saying, oh, you have these many carbon emissions. Now, who's going to pay the cost for this? And now you want to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and who's going to pay for it? So those same equity and distributional questions remain. And while it's interesting from a research perspective, but from like in terms of reality, I think we are looking at a very grim scenario. And I'm not mixing any words to say that it's really looking, I mean, if we don't take action in the next 5 or 7 years, we've really missed the bus, and then we don't have a very good understanding of what the future, I mean, we do have projections, but we don't have a good understanding of the uncertainty, and it could be far worse than what's projected in IPCC reports. It could be maybe not that bad, but we really don't know, because there are some sensitivities about nature and about the Earth system that we really don't know. So well, that we are trying to play God by by trying to invest in some of these technologies, but I think scientifically these technologies are still unproven at scale.
No, I do agree with that. And coming from that perspective now to, I think, somewhere cities' perspective as well, because I think across the globe or India, the cities have been growing drastically in terms of volume of people, or in terms of how they are consuming energy, how they're even generating money. So somewhere it kind of fuels the ecosystem in itself, which is causing cities to grow more and more as well. Now, you did mention that energy is one, building is one, and transport is. These are the three major things which will help us start mitigating things on the line. But one of the biggest challenge I think with energy comes is that it's not possible, while solar or wind is considered as a good source of electricity, but it is not possible to generate it locally as well, because there's not enough space inside the city to do bigger power plants, and that generally has its own challenges. So what are the other things that can also be thought of to make sure that cities are sustainable, and when their growth is happening at one point, we are also able to mitigate the amount of emissions that it is going to come? Because I think from the emissions perspective, cities are one of the evils that we might have to look at.
So I think one is, I mean, if we talk about buildings, then it's the built form, right? The way we are constructing our buildings, the materials we are choosing, and the building design, layout, orientation. So basically urban planning and design, but also building infrastructure. And I mentioned this before, that I don't think we are doing a very good job of it, because we are emulating buildings in other parts of the world which are not suitable to the Indian climate. And increasingly the new buildings that are coming up are almost air condition dependent. So I think that's one solution that cities in India should think very seriously about. The other solution is just compact development. And if you look at the data for Indian cities, then you'll see that most of this growth has happened with a decrease in density, and therefore we have increasing urban sprawl, as a result of which we are changing our land use. And if you want more land for planning cities, then you have to cut forests or take away land from agriculture, all of which contributes to emissions from land use change. So it's not just the solutions within cities, but when you make cities, or when cities grow, they have other implications for land and emissions, which we don't often consider. And just compact development with transportation, because transportation is really one of the major emitters within cities. So if we had more compact urban forms with public transport infrastructure, it's happening, but I think we need to do this a lot more. It would reduce the dependence on cars, and therefore the emissions directly from transport, but also like the term that we use, co-benefits for air quality and public health. So, I mean, look at the cities. I mean, without mitigation also, if you didn't have the challenge of climate change, is this the cities that we are aspiring for, which are choked with traffic and
Yeah.
congested, and there's no quality of life? So, if every city emulates, let's talk about the top 7 cities in India, right? If every city in India goes the Ahmedabad way, so just to give you an example, I think we are going to have a major problem on our hands, and it's not only going to be climate change.
Yeah, I do agree with it, but one of the biggest things that I have at least realized, I will not even say that I've studied it, but I have realized is behavior, and I think with growing cities and affordability that people have right now, everyone wants everything faster, everyone wants everything customized, everyone wants everything uh, tuned for their own way, and that kind of leads to the kind system, and that is where I think behavior is one of the necessary things that we are looking at. For Indian context, how are we then going to solve this as a problem? Because it's not that we are not efficient. We will make sure that we use everything as efficiently as possible to a certain extent, but we also demand a lot many more new things now because of affordability. So it's a rising change that I think with the youth, with adults coming in with more money. Uh, so there is an integrated efficiency part, I feel, but at the same time there is an increase in just resources that they want. It's not that. How are we going to tackle this behavior problem? Because I think that is where somewhere solution might also lie.
You sound like you've studied this, not just realized this. I think it's a very valid, well-framed question. So let me just start from what the IPCC report says. So for the first time, we realized that the potential from behavioral change is much larger than what we thought it was. Traditionally, we've only focused on technologies, but now we look at the numbers and it shows that 40 to 70% of the emission reduction can actually happen with behavior change. That said, behavior change alone will not solve the problem. And so the report clearly says that behavior change is enabled, right? Behavior change itself is an enabler, but it is also enabled by the access to technology sometimes, by the provision of infrastructure, and therefore governments or the private sector needs to provide that infrastructure for people to change their behavior. That's one aspect of it. There are, I mean, like the simple example is that there are people who are willing to change their behavior, but they are unable to because they don't have the necessary support.
Yeah.
Right? So that's one solution. The second solution is what we call in the IPCC report choice architecture, which is a term to say how choices are presented to consumers. So when people are presented a choice and they know the implications of the choice, they would probably choose a more sustainable option, whether we talk about labeling for appliances or for efficiency of cars. So it's like how I think we need to think about this a little more seriously. That how are choices presented to consumers? Do they know the implications of the choices they are making? And the third and the final thing is about reducing the emissions from that trap, the rising incomes, and that, as you said, is the biggest challenge. That with incomes increasing, people want more. They want bigger cars, bigger homes, more material needs. So I think that awareness is the key, and podcasts like these and so many things that are happening in mainstream need to be ramped up. And I see a lot of mainstream media trying to address this now in the last 3 or 4 years, but it has not happened before. We need to start, I think, in schools and colleges. I do sometimes speak to younger audiences, and they're way more informed than we think they are. But yet, I don't think climate change has found its place in schools as much as it needs to be. And it could be like in some schools, some elite schools, or sometimes even in some traditional schools. But I think we need to look at raising awareness in the younger population, because I think somehow there is a lock-in with adults that's harder to break than with young people.
But I do agree. Like I will say that my nieces and nephews have more understanding about climate change than my brothers and sisters. And they're pretty young, 10, 15 years old, and they know much more about it. And I think their behavior is much more attuned to this whole narrative as well, that okay, as we are going to grow up, we will have to face this and this that. I feel it's about 20, 25 years of age, where from that to somewhere over 45, they understand somewhere broad lines of climate change, but they don't know how to act on it. And this is the spot where I think rising income also comes into picture, because these are the people who are earning and consuming, and they have more income which they can disposable income. And that change is, at least from my understanding, requires much better adoption in general. I don't know how that is possible to bring out, but that is something I would be happy to also explore. That okay, how do we target this audience and someone of these lines so that they are able to convert and, as you said, maybe hopefully get 40 to 70% emission reduction due to behavior, because they might be the people who we are trying to target.
No, I think I don't have a very simple answer to this problem. Otherwise, we will solve it long ago. but we talk about these. For example, you talk about architects. You talk about the rich people who can serve as role models. And we do touch upon this, but there isn't enough scientific evidence on this. That when people emulate role models, can these role models enable the change? In India, for example, it could be Bollywood actors. And we do know a few, but like not as many, I think. And we need change at every level, I think, starting from the bottom up. But one of the things that intrigues me is why climate change is still not an election issue in India. That politically, why does it not influence conversations in the living room? It does now because we are seeing the change in climate. But yet in the age group that you speak about, change is most needed, and it's not happening. I think it's also the onus on businesses and how they operate, right? It's not just consumer responsibility, but it's producer responsibility. And I touch upon the Sustainable Development Goal 12 and how companies produce and sell. That influences how people consume and want to. So I think we need change at both ends.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and somewhere my belief is also along the lines that we do have a constant amount of disasters in all cities per se. That there is heat wave, then there is flooding, then there is smog everywhere. So I think across India as well, most of the cities face these kind of issues. It's not that it's not there, but people have still not been able to place that as how this is going to affect them more and more.
Right, and that's the thing about climate. When you look out of the window, you don't see climate change, right?
Yeah.
You sometimes see air pollution and you can complain about it. But the thing with India is that there's an event and there's a conversation around it. There's somebody to blame, and then it dies down. And then there's another event which replaces that, and we have these conversations. I would say when the heat wave happened, there was a lot of conversation around heat. But now that's replaced by flood. Sometimes that's replaced by stubble burning. And yet we haven't really gone to the stage where we look for a long-term answer to the problem.
No, absolutely. I think it's a fascinating problem, and I think we need a solution faster. And I think on those lines, I would like to then ask one of the questions that we ask everyone, that yes, it's a problem. We know that we need to solve it. Then what are the skill sets required to solve it? I think that is something, I know it's a very broad when we're talking about climate change in general. There are a lot of things that are required, but let's say from a mitigation perspective, what do you think what are the different skill sets required in India right now to make sure that we can transition to this?
No matter what profession you take, you're going to have to take on the climate challenge, right? Whether they go into banking, because now you will need bankers to understand and assess risks to future projects. Whether you're in the insurance industry, people from social and behavioral and humanities disciplines need to understand how these behavioral choices will happen. People from management will have to look at different ways of marketing to see how these sustainable practices can be sustained and enhanced. If you're from urban planning, then there's a lot of scope to rework on our cities. If people are farmers, we really need to understand loss and damage and find ways to understand and maybe more economic incentives and how these would be used. And let me think of what else. I think what I'm really missing here is the art, communication, languages, because and history. And so I've been speaking to a few colleagues in these disciplines, and it's great that this conversation is just about started. Not so much in India, I would say, but we really need people who can communicate climate change, right? And you have these art installations, like in London, this artist, she puts up these mass blocks of ice and allows people to come and watch them melt and see how they feel about it. And so there's a lot of public art stuff happening globally, and somewhat in India also. Then I have a colleague who writes kids' books about climate change. So there's like a whole range of skills. I mean, you need people with data and maths, for example. You need statisticians to look at climate data and all the rainfall stuff that will be generated. So I think there's a lot of scope for future employment, so to say. But I think to put it from a solutions perspective, it's not about the opportunity, but it's about the need, and we really need younger people to come up with fresh ideas and solutions to address, because clearly we haven't solved it, so we just left it to them. So I'm just calling out to the younger listeners on this podcast that please help. The planet needs you, whatever you're doing.
No, absolutely. I think it's super important, and we need to make sure that somewhere more and more solutions come into picture. Otherwise, as well as the behavioral adaptability of this. I think both those things are important at this junction in time. Then only, because it's not that behavior science has not come into the mainstream. We are using it for consumerism. It needs to change to the other side of it.
Of course.
So somewhere, I don't know how that's going to pan out, but I think it's super important to cater to both of them. But if I have missed out on any point that you would like to cover and you would like to help audience understand in a better way, feel free. I think we have somewhere to wrap it up.
Yeah, I think we haven't touched on the policy and governance aspect enough, and often in these conversations we tend to look at the government for solutions, and what we really need to highlight is that, of course, it is the government's responsibility both at the national and subnational level, but really the private sector hasn't been doing enough at all, and citizens. So therefore calling out to other stakeholders also to solve the climate problem is an important point to make, I think, in today's time.
No, absolutely. I think, and a lot of initiatives are coming up with the private sector on the line of ESG. But I'm also very amateur, just starting to learn a bit more about it, but not sure how effective it is and what extent it is effective. That is something still need to figure it out from the government's perspective. So thank you so much. I think this was a great conversation. Thank you so much for your time, and I really enjoyed talking and understanding this from the science of it.
Thank you so much for having me, and hope you found some useful takeaways for the listeners.
I absolutely did, and I hope audience is able to find something for their own as well.
Thank you for tuning into the podcast. Do subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform and follow us on all social media channels. For more details about the Climate Center for Cities and registration on Climate Practitioners India Network, click on the link in the show notes. The episode is conceptualized and produced by Punit Gandhi. A big thank you to the whole team at C-Cube and NIUA for supporting the development of the podcast. Stay tuned for the next episode.